Harlem, Tuesday, November 8, 1932. 11:47 p.m. A cold wind slid through Lenox Avenue like a blade. Streetlights flickered. A jazz horn cried somewhere behind brick walls. And inside the back office of a numbers spot disguised as a barbershop, Bumpy Johnson sat perfectly still, coat still on, hat still on, staring at a telephone like it had just insulted him. The phone rang again. Not loud. Not urgent. Just, Bumpy didn't jump. He didn't rush it. He waited until the third ring like he was deciding whether the call deserved to live. Then he picked it up. Johnson. At first there was only breathing. Then a voice low, trembling, trying to sound like it wasn't afraid. Bumpy, it's me. Bumpy's jaw tightened. He recognized it immediately. Eddie St. Parker. One of Bumpy's own men. A runner. A friend since they were both nobodies. Eddie was the kind of guy who smiled too much because he'd seen what happened to men who didn't. Bumpy leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded. Eddie, you calling me at midnight means you're either dying or stupid. Eddie swallowed hard on the other end. I didn't know who else to call. I messed up. Bumpy didn't say a word. Silence was the sharpest knife he owned. Eddie continued, voice cracking now. They made me do it, Bumpy. They got my wife. They got Mabel and the baby. She's sick, you know that she's been coughing blood again, and I can't afford the doctor. Bumpy's eyes flickered at the mention of the baby. He knew Eddie's little boy. Knew the kid's name. Knew the kid's laugh. Then Eddie said the sentence that froze the whole room. I told them where you'll be tomorrow. The barbershop office became a tomb. Even the men guarding the door stopped breathing. Bumpy's fingers tightened around the receiver. Who, Bumpy said, voice calm like ice, is them? Eddie hesitated too long. And in that hesitation, Bumpy already had the answer. Because for weeks, Harlem had been whispering about a new pressure moving through the streets, quiet men with clean coats, strange accents, and too much confidence. Dutch Schultz's people. Dutch had been pushing into Harlem like a disease. Buying cops. Buying politicians. Buying anybody who wanted to eat without getting shot. But Eddie wasn't supposed to be reachable. Eddie was Bumpy's blood. Eddie was protected. Which meant this wasn't a random leak. This wasn't a careless mistake. This was something worse. Bumpy's voice went colder. You gave Schultz my location. Eddie started crying. A grown man breaking apart like wet paper. I didn't want to, Bumpy. I swear I didn't. They said they'd throw Mabel out the window. They said they... Bumpy cut him off. Where am I supposed to be tomorrow? Eddie whispered it. St. Clair Social Club. Back room, noon. Bumpy stared at the wall like he could see tomorrow already waiting there with a gun. Then Eddie spoke again, faster now, desperate. Bumpy, listen, there's something else. Something I heard when they thought I wasn't listening. Bumpy's eyes narrowed. What? Eddie inhaled, and the words came out like poison. They're not just trying to kill you. Bumpy's face didn't change, but every man in that office felt the air shift. Eddie whispered, they're trying to make it look like your own crew did it. A beat of silence. Then from the receiver, a second sound appeared, faint, metallic, like a click. A line being picked up. Someone else was listening. Bumpy didn't blink. He didn't react. He just spoke softly into the phone. Eddie, don't move. Eddie's voice trembled. What, why? Because Bumpy knew that sound. That click meant Eddie wasn't alone anymore. And then Eddie screamed. Not words. Not sentences. Just a raw scream, sharp, choking like hands had grabbed him from behind. Bumpy stood up so fast his chair slammed backward. Eddie! The scream cut off. A new voice replaced it, smooth, amused, confident. Well. Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy's nostrils flared. He knew that voice too. A man named Leonard Pike, one of Schultz's main enforcers. A butcher with manners. Pike chuckled into the receiver like the world was entertaining him. That was a real touching conversation. Family, loyalty, all that. Bumpy's voice became quiet thunder. Where's Eddie? Pike didn't answer directly. He didn't have to. Instead, Pike said, "Tomorrow at noon, you're walking into your own funeral." Bumpy didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He only asked one question, slow and deadly. "Are you calling to scare me or to brag?" Pike smiled through the line. "To confirm." And then he added, almost politely, "Oh, and Bumpy, don't bother changing plans. We already planned for that too." The line went dead. Bumpy stood there holding the receiver, eyes locked on nothing. A single phone call had just done something bullets couldn't. It exposed the truth. Someone inside Bumpy's circle wasn't just weak. Someone was controlled. And tomorrow at noon, Harlem wasn't just going to see an ambush, it was going to see whether Bumpy Johnson could survive an attack designed to destroy him from the inside. Bumpy slowly placed the receiver down. Then he turned to his men and said the most dangerous thing a leader can say, "Lock the door." He stared at the phone like it might ring again. And in his calm voice, there was a storm. "Now we find out who else is on that line. Because if Eddie tracked, who was next? And how many of Bumpy's own people were already bought?" Harlem, Wednesday, November 9th, 1932. 1:12 a.m. 3 hours after the call ended, the barbershop office still felt like it was holding its breath. The place smelled like hot metal and cold fear. Bumpy Johnson stood over a small table where the phone sat like a dead animal. His men waited behind him, big shoulders, quiet eyes, hands never far from waistbands. But Bumpy wasn't looking at his guns. He was thinking about Eddie Parker's voice, how it broke when he said Mabel. That name wasn't just a detail. It was a weight. Because Bumpy knew exactly who Mabel was. She was Eddie's wife. A seamstress. Proud, sharp-tongued, always fighting life like it owed her money. And she'd been sick for months, scoffing blood into rags she hid so Eddie wouldn't panic. And Eddie? Eddie was the kind of man who could take a beating without flinching, but the moment they threatened his family, he would crawl through broken glass to save them. That was the trap. And it was the kind of trap that didn't just get men killed. It turned them into weapons. Bumpy's right-hand man stepped forward. Blanche Whitey Morrison. A tall, square-jawed Harlem soldier with a calm face and a brutal memory. Whitey didn't talk much. When he did, people listened. "Boss," Whitey said quietly, "we can cancel St. Clair tomorrow. Set a fake meeting somewhere else. Let Pike walk in." Bumpy cut him off with a hand. "No." Whitey's eyes narrowed. "No?" Bumpy turned, and now the room could feel him like electricity crawling across skin. "If Schultz's people can force Eddie, they can force anyone," Bumpy said. "And if they can force anyone, then hiding isn't safety." He leaned closer, voice low. "Hiding tells them we're scared." Whitey didn't argue. He just studied Bumpy's face, trying to read whether this was pride or strategy. Then Bumpy spoke again, sharp as a match being struck. "We're going to St. Clair." One of the younger men blurted, "They said it's a funeral." Bumpy stared at him until the boy's throat closed. "It might be," Bumpy said, "but it won't be mine." Then he finally moved away from the phone and crossed to the small window overlooking the street. Outside, Harlem was quiet in that late-night way, still alive, still listening. Bumpy watched the empty sidewalk like he expected Betrayal to walk by wearing a nice suit. And then, in a voice that wasn't meant for the whole room, he said something only Whitey heard. "Eddie didn't call to save me." Whitey leaned in. "Then why?" Bumpy's eyes didn't blink. "He called because he wanted someone to remember he didn't start as a traitor." That landed heavy. Because everyone in that room understood the truth. Eddie was already dead. Even if he wasn't in the ground yet. Schultz didn't keep loose ends alive. And Eddie had heard too much. Bumpy turned back around. "Find Mabel," he ordered. Whitey hesitated. "Right now?" "Right now." Bumpy's men scattered like shadows. And while they moved, Bumpy thought about Eddie's life, the pressure that had been squeezing him long before Schultz ever put a hand on him. Eddie Parker wasn't greedy. He was drowning. 2 months ago, Eddie's boy had gotten feverish, shaking in a tenement bed with no heat. Eddie went to a doctor who didn't even look him in the eye. "You want medicine?" the doctor said. Eddie didn't have money like that. Not clean money. So Eddie did what most men in Harlem did when the world backed them into a corner. He borrowed. But not from Bumpy. from someone smaller. Someone fast. Someone who pretended to be friendly. A man named Rocco Di Maio. Rocco wasn't Italian royalty. He was an errand dog for Schultz's crew, one of those men who smiled too much and asked too many questions. Rocco loaned Eddie money. And when Eddie couldn't pay fast enough, the loan didn't stay a loan. It became a leash. It became bring me something. A name. A location. A rumor. And Eddie, trying to keep his kid alive, began feeding the leash. Not big things at first. Small things. Harmless things. Until Schultz tightened it. Then came Mabel's sickness. Then came the threats. Then came the window. And suddenly Eddie wasn't a man with a problem, he was a man with a knife held over his family. A moral choice with no clean exit. That's what made it cruel. That's what made it brilliant. Because Schultz didn't need Eddie to love him. He just needed Eddie to be afraid. And now Bumpy had to make his own choice, punish Eddie as a traitor, or save Eddie's family as proof Harlem still had rules. At 2:06 a.m., Whitey returned breathing hard. "Boss, we found her." Bumpy didn't ask where. His eyes said, "Tell me everything." Whitey spoke fast, voice tight. "Mabel's not home." Bumpy's face stayed still. But the room temperature dropped. Whitey continued. "Her neighbor said 2 men came earlier. Clean coats. Said they were taking her to a clinic." Bumpy's jaw clenched. That wasn't a clinic. That was a warning. Whitey swallowed. "And boss, they left something behind." Bumpy's eyes sharpened. "What?" Whitey pulled a small object from his pocket and placed it on the table. A child's toy. A tiny wooden train. With a note tied around it. Bumpy unfolded the note with 2 fingers like it was contaminated. The message was short, written neat. "Noon. St. Clair. Come alone." Bumpy stared at the words so long it looked like he might burn them through paper. Then he said, calmly, "They took her alive." Whitey nodded. "Yes." Bumpy's voice stayed quiet, but every man in the room felt the violence inside it. "Then Eddie's still alive too?" Whitey frowned. "How you know?" Bumpy tapped the note once. "Because dead men don't need instructions." He looked around at his crew. "If Schultz is telling me to come alone," he said, "it means he wants to talk." A younger man whispered, "Or he wants to make an example." Bumpy turned slowly. "Same thing," he said. He folded the note and slid it into his coat pocket. Then he stared at the phone again, like he could still hear Eddie screaming. And he asked the question that mattered more than guns. If Eddie betrayed me to save his family? Bumpy's eyes swept across every face in the room. Which one of you would do the same? No one answered. Because that was the danger. Not Schultz. Not Pike. Not the ambush. The danger was realizing that every man in Harlem had a breaking point, and Schultz had just proven he knew how to find it. Bumpy stepped toward the door. "Get the car ready," he said. "And wake the doctor." Whitey blinked. "Doctor? For who?" Bumpy's voice hardened. "For Mabel." He paused at the door, just long enough to let the threat hang in the air. "And if we're too late?" His eyes went dark. "Then Harlem is about to learn what happens when you use a family as bait." He opened the door. Cold air rushed in like destiny. And behind him the phone sat silent. Waiting. Like it still had one more betrayal to reveal. But what Bumpy didn't know yet was that the note wasn't Schultz's plan. It was someone else's handwriting. Someone closer. Someone inside. Harlem, Wednesday, November 9th, 1932. 9:38 a.m. Morning in Harlem didn't feel clean. It felt watched. The streets looked normal, women carrying groceries, kids hopping over puddles, men in caps arguing over newspapers, but everything underneath was tense, like a drum pulled tight. Bumpy Johnson rode in the back seat of a black sedan, staring through the glass as if the world outside was a chessboard. Whitey drove. 2 other men followed in a second car. No sirens. No noise. Just quiet movement like predators moving through tall grass. At 9:51 a.m., the sedan reached a narrow building near 137th Street. A clinic that barely deserved the name. One room, one weary doctor, and a hallway that smelled like bleach and old pain. Bumpy stepped inside. The doctor, Dr. Solomon Green, looked up from his desk like he'd seen ghosts before and wasn't interested in more. "Mr. Johnson," Green said carefully, "this is not a good hour for—" Bumpy cut him off. "I'm not here for me." Whitey shut the door behind them and stood guard. Bumpy placed the wooden toy train on the doctor's desk. "They left this," Bumpy said, "with a note. A mother's been taken. She's sick, coughing blood." Dr. Green's eyes narrowed. "Tuberculosis?" Bumpy didn't answer. He didn't need to. The doctor's face tightened because in Harlem, TB wasn't an illness. It was a slow execution. "And you want me to—" Green began. "I want you ready," Bumpy said. "A bed. Supplies. And I want you to stop asking why." The doctor stared at him. He looked like a man trying to decide whether helping was bravery or suicide. Then he said quietly, "If she's been moved in the cold, if she's stressed, she could hemorrhage." Bumpy leaned forward, voice low. "Then you better be ready to keep her alive." Because that was the real choice Bumpy was making. Not whether to go to St. Clair, but whether this situation would end with vengeance or with mercy that cost him respect. Harlem had rules, and Bumpy had built part of his name on those rules. You didn't touch a man's family. You didn't threaten women. You didn't use children as leverage. Dutch Schultz didn't care about Harlem's rules. So Bumpy would have to show him what happens when you ignore them. But first, Bumpy needed to know something even worse. Who delivered Schultz the leverage? Back in the car, Whitey spoke without turning his head. "We got eyes on St. Clair," he said. "2 men posted already. Not locals." Bumpy's gaze stayed forward. "Pike's people." Whitey nodded once. Then he hesitated like a man about to step on a landmine. "And there's something else," Whitey added. Bumpy didn't look at him. "Say it." Whitey's throat moved. "Eddie didn't borrow money from Rocco by accident." Bumpy's eyes finally shifted. Whitey continued. "One of our guys introduced them." Bumpy's voice stayed calm, but the calm had teeth. "Name," Whitey exhaled. "Louis Lucky Mercer." The name hit the car like a gunshot. Lucky Mercer wasn't just a soldier. He was a trusted era man who handled meetings, routes, protection schedules. The kind of man who knew where Bumpy would be before Bumpy said it out loud. Bumpy stared out the window at passing buildings, and for a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, "Lucky's been with me 8 years." Whitey nodded. "That's why I didn't want to say it." Bumpy's jaw tightened. 8 years meant loyalty. 8 years meant dinners at the same table. 8 years meant Lucky had looked Bumpy in the eyes 1,000 times and never blinked. But it also meant Lucky knew where to put the knife. Bumpy leaned back slightly, thinking fast. If Lucky introduced Eddie to Rocco, then Lucky either made a mistake or Lucky made a sale. And Bumpy didn't believe in mistakes that convenient. At 10:27 a.m., they reached a brownstone where Lucky Mercer lived. Whitey and 2 men moved ahead, quiet, controlled. They knocked. No answer. Whitey tried the knob. Unlocked. That was wrong. Inside, the place smelled of cigarette smoke and something else. Something sour. Whitey entered first. Bumpy followed, coat unbuttoned but hands relaxed like he didn't fear death. They moved room to room. Then they found it. In the kitchen, on the floor, was a chair tipped sideways. On the table sat a plate of eggs gone cold. And beside it, a glass of water with a cigarette floating in it like it had been dropped mid-sentence. Whitey's eyes scanned the room. "No blood," he whispered. Bumpy noticed the radio. It was still playing low volume like someone wanted the house to feel alive. But the house wasn't alive. It was staged. Bumpy stepped closer to the table. There was a note. Not in an envelope. Just placed there like it didn't fear being read. Bumpy picked it up. 2 lines. "He talks too much noon. St. Clair. Come alone." Same words as before. Same pressure. Same sit politeness. Whitey's fists clenched. They were here. Bumpy didn't respond. Because something else caught his eye. A detail most men would miss. The handwriting. It wasn't Pike's. Not Schultz's. It was careful. Familiar. Bumpy had seen it before. On ledgers. On delivery slips. On Bumpy's own paperwork. His mind snapped to a face instantly. And suddenly, the betrayal stopped being abstract and became personal. Because the handwriting belonged to someone who didn't just know Bumpy's movements, it belonged to someone who handled Bumpy's money. Bumpy folded the note slowly. Whitey watched him. "Boss?" Whitey asked, cautious now. "You know who wrote that?" Bumpy's voice came out cold. "Yes." Whitey swallowed. "Who?" Bumpy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out at the street like he was watching his own fate approach. Then he spoke low, controlled. "Schultz didn't get Eddie first." Whitey frowned. "What?" Bumpy's eyes narrowed. "He got someone else and used them to reach Eddie." Whitey's heart sank. "You saying Lucky?" Bumpy cut him off. "No. Lucky's already gone. He's the cover." Bumpy turned back, eyes sharp. The real traitor is still breathing. Outside, the city kept moving like nothing had changed. But inside that house, Bumpy felt it clearly. This wasn't just a hit. This was an operation. A slow tightening rope around his crew. A test. And the moment Bumpy stepped into St. Clair at noon, he wasn't just facing Schultz. He was facing his own circle and the rot inside it. Whitey leaned closer, voice urgent. "Boss, we can't let you go alone." Bumpy's smile was small and dangerous. "That's the point," he said. He tapped the folded note against his palm. "They want me alone because they think I'll panic." He looked at Whitey. "I'm going alone because I want them comfortable." Whitey stared at him. Bumpy's voice dropped to a whisper. "Comfortable men make mistakes." He turned toward the door. And with every step, the clock sounded louder in his head. Because noon wasn't just a meeting. Noon was a trap. And the trap was designed to force Bumpy to choose, save Eddie's family, or erase the traitor inside his house. And the cruelest part, he might not be able to do both. As they walked out, Whitey asked the one question nobody wanted to ask. "Boss, what if Eddie's already dead?" Bumpy paused. Then answered without turning around. "Then whoever killed him is about to learn something." Whitey swallowed. "What?" Bumpy's voice was iron. "That a phone call can expose betrayal." He stepped into the sunlight. "But it can also start a war." And as the cars pulled away towards St. Clair, Bumpy didn't know it yet, but the man who wrote those notes was already waiting inside the club, smiling. Close enough to shake his hand. Harlem, Wednesday, November 9th, 1932. 11:58 a.m. St. Clair's social club looked too normal to be a graveyard. From the street it was just another Harlem building with frosted windows, a doorman in a coat too thin for November, and music leaking out like the place was full of joy instead of bullets. Bumpy Johnson stepped out of the sedan alone. No visible guards. No second car parked behind him. No men hovering nearby. Just Bumpy, hat low, collar up, walking into a trap like he owned it. The doorman opened the door immediately, as if he'd been told exactly what time Bumpy would arrive. Inside, warmth hit him. Cigarette smoke. Cheap cologne. Laughter too loud, too forced. Men at tables pretending not to stare. Bumpy didn't scan the whole room. He didn't need to. He only watched the exits. 2 men near the back, pretending to drink. 1 man near the stairs, pretending to look bored. A bartender wiping the same glass like his life depended on it. Every one of them was placed. Bumpy walked through the club at a steady pace, not rushed, not hesitant calm enough to insult the men waiting to kill him. At the far end was a door leading to the back room. The same back room where Eddie said the ambush would happen. Bumpy turned the knob and stepped in. The room was smaller than the club floor, lit by a single hanging lamp that made everyone look guilty. A long table. 3 chairs. An ashtray already filled like someone had been waiting a long time. And sitting at the table with a cigarette between his fingers was Leonard Pike. Pike looked up slowly, smiling like a man greeting a guest instead of a target. "Mister," Johnson, Pike said, voice smooth. You came alone. I'm impressed. Bumpy didn't sit. He stood with his hands relaxed at his sides and said flatly, Where's Eddie Parker? Pike's smile didn't move. Oh, Pike said lightly, straight to business. No pleasantries. Bumpy stepped closer. I'll ask again, Bumpy said, voice quiet. Where's Eddie? Pike tapped ash into the tray. That was all. But the way Pike said it casual, dismissive made something in Bumpy's chest tighten like wire. Because unavailable didn't mean missing. It meant finished. Bumpy stared at Pike like he could force truth out of him by will alone. And Mabel, Bumpy said. And the baby. Pike leaned back and crossed his legs. The wife's alive, Pike said. For now. Bumpy didn't flinch. But the air around him sharpened. Pike smiled wider. Relax, Pike said. We didn't call you here to spill blood in the club. Not yet. Bumpy's eyes narrowed. Then why am I here? Pike spread his hands. To offer you something you can't buy. Bumpy said nothing. Pike continued, enjoying the moment. Dutch Schultz is a practical man, Pike said. He's willing to leave Harlem breathing, if Harlem behaves. Bumpy's lip curled slightly, but he didn't speak. Pike leaned forward. You're not stupid, Bumpy. You know what's happening. The city's changing. The money's changing. The police are changing. A man like you can either adjust or get broken. Bumpy stared at him. Pike's voice softened, almost friendly. So here's the deal. Dutch wants you to meet him halfway. You keep your small corner and you stop interfering with his business. In return, the wife and baby go home. Bumpy's jaw tightened. And Eddie. Pike shrugged. Pike didn't say it. But he shrugged it. Eddie wasn't part of the deal. Bumpy swallowed rage like a bitter pill. And if I refuse, Bumpy asked. Pike's smile returned like a weapon being drawn. Then Mabel becomes a widow. Bumpy leaned closer until the hanging lamp lit his eyes like fire. You tell Schultz something, Bumpy said. He can have my body before he gets my cooperation. Pike chuckled like Bumpy had made a joke. Then Pike reached into his pocket and pulled out something that changed the room instantly. A folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table and slid it forward. Before you get dramatic, Pike said, you should read that. Bumpy didn't touch it. What is it? Pike's smile sharpened. A list. Bumpy's eyes flicked down. Pike continued. Names. Addresses. Meetings. Dates. Payments. Every detail of your operation. Bumpy's stomach turned slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. Because he knew those details weren't guessed. They were recorded. Only someone inside his circle could provide that. Pike watched Bumpy's face carefully. You're wondering who gave it to us, Pike said. Bumpy's voice was dangerous. I already know. Pike laughed softly. No, Pike said. You think you know? That's the best part. Then Pike raised his voice toward the closed door. Bring him in. The door opened. And in walked a man Bumpy trusted enough to turn his back on. Calvin Ricks. Bumpy's accountant. His numbers man. A thin, sharp-faced Harlem native with careful hair, clean cuffs, and eyes that never held warmth. Calvin was the man who handled collections, paid bribes, kept the books balanced, and made sure Bumpy's money didn't get him arrested. Calvin looked nervous but not ashamed. He avoided Bumpy's eyes like a man walking into a confession. Bumpy didn't speak at first. He stared at Calvin as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Then Bumpy said softly, Calvin. Calvin's throat moved. He didn't answer. Pike smiled as if he'd just revealed a magic trick. Surprise, Pike said. Bumpy's voice came out like ice scraping stone. You wrote the notes. Calvin flinched. Pike leaned closer to Bumpy, almost whispering. He wrote the notes, Pike said. He introduced Eddie to Rocco. He gave us Lucky Mercer's schedule. He gave us your meeting location. Bumpy's fists tightened slowly. Calvin finally spoke, voice shaky, desperate to sound like he wasn't the villain. I didn't have a choice, Bumpy. Bumpy turned his head slightly, eyes locked on Calvin. No? Bumpy whispered. No choice? Calvin swallowed hard. They came to me first, Calvin blurted. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd hand my sister to the vice squad. She's barely 18. She doesn't know how to survive that. Bumpy's face did not soften. Calvin kept going, voice breaking. They said they'd ruin her. They said they'd take her away from me. And you don't pay me enough to fight Dutch Schultz. That sentence hung in the room like smoke. Bumpy slowly turned back to Pike. And Eddie, Bumpy said, voice low. Pike's smile was thin now. Eddie was collateral, Pike said. Bumpy's jaw clenched. Pike leaned back again, satisfied. And Lucky Mercer? Pike added. He was your loyal man, right? We didn't even have to kill him. We just told Calvin to invite him to breakfast. After that, easy. Bumpy stared at Calvin. Calvin's eyes filled with tears. I didn't want Lucky dead, Calvin whispered. I didn't. Bumpy stepped forward so fast Calvin flinched backward. Bumpy's voice rose slightly, not shouting, but louder than he ever needed to be. You killed him. Calvin shook his head, crying now. I didn't pull the trigger. Bumpy cut him off. You handed him the door. Silence. Pike watched like this was theatre. Then Pike said the words that flipped the entire situation. Now here's the part you didn't see coming, Bumpy. Bumpy's eyes narrowed. Pike smiled slow, cruel. Calvin didn't just betray you for fear. Bumpy's face tightened. Pike continued. He betrayed you for money. Calvin froze. Bumpy turned slowly, disbelief sharpening into rage. Pike pulled a small envelope from his jacket and tossed it on the table. Inside were crisp bills. More money than Calvin made in a year. Calvin whispered, No, that's not. Pike interrupted, voice loud. He asked for it, Pike said. He named his price. Calvin's knees looked weak. Bumpy's expression didn't explode. It hardened. Because now it wasn't just survival. It was greed. And greed was unforgivable. But then, Pike delivered the real twist, the one that made Bumpy's blood run colder than winter. Pike leaned in, eyes bright. And you know why Dutch insisted you come alone? Bumpy didn't answer. Pike smiled wider. Because your own men are outside right now, being stopped. Bumpy's eyes sharpened. Pike nodded toward the window. 2 cops. Paid cops. They've got Whitey held up 3 blocks away. Search. Delay. Questions. All legal. Bumpy's mind moved instantly. If Whitey was delayed, Bumpy truly was alone. Pike's voice dropped to a whisper. And Mabel, Pike said softly. She's in a room upstairs. Bumpy's chest tightened. Pike continued. 1 phone call from me, and she goes out the window. Bumpy stared at Pike, and now he understood. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a noose. Pike leaned back in his chair. So, Pike said, smiling like a man about to watch a hanging. Here's Dutch's final offer. Bumpy's voice came out deadly calm. What? Pike's eyes gleamed. You walk out of Harlem. Bumpy didn't blink. You disappear, Pike said. No meetings. No numbers. No crews. No control. You leave the city and, in exchange, the wife and baby live. Bumpy looked at Calvin again, at the trembling traitor who couldn't even meet his gaze. And in that moment, Bumpy had to make a decision that would define the rest of the story. Because if he refused, Mabel dies. If he accepts, Harlem dies. Bumpy's voice dropped to a whisper. You set this whole thing up, he said to Calvin. Calvin sobbed. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Bumpy stepped back slightly. Then he did something nobody expected. He reached into his coat pocket slowly. Pike's men outside the door tensed. Calvin whimpered. Bumpy pulled out a small folded paper. Not a gun. A note. And he slid it across the table to Pike. Pike frowned, confused. What's that? Bumpy's eyes locked on Pike with terrifying calm. It's my answer, Bumpy said. Pike unfolded it, and his smile vanished. Because written on the paper were 3 words. You're too late. Pike's eyes snapped up. Bumpy's voice stayed quiet. You think I came here to beg? Bumpy said. I came here to confirm. Pike's throat tightened. Confirm what? Then the club downstairs erupted into chaos. A sudden crash. Screams. A gunshot. Pike jerked toward the door. Bumpy didn't move, because Bumpy had already set his own trap, and the betrayal Calvin's betrayal was only the first layer. The second layer was already closing. Pike lunged for the door, and Bumpy smiled slightly, because the war had already started, and Pike was trapped inside the very room he thought was safe. But one question remained. If Whitey was delayed, who the hell just fired that gun downstairs? Harlem, Wednesday, November 9th, 1932. 12:06 p.m. The gunshot downstairs didn't sound like chaos. It sounded like permission. Pike froze with his hand halfway to the doorknob. His eyes flicked to Bumpy, trying to understand whether he'd been tricked or surrounded. Bumpy didn't rush. He didn't flinch. He simply stood there like the room belonged to him. Then another sound. A crash, tables tipping, glass shattering, followed by a scream that cut through the club like a knife. Pike's voice tightened. What did you do? Bumpy's answer was quiet. I stopped listening to your rules. Pike yanked the door open and one of his men stumbled backward into the room, face pale, eyes wide. Pike, the man gasped. They're in here, somebody's. A second shot cracked. The man's sentence ended in blood. He collapsed right in the doorway. Pike recoiled, rage and fear twisting together. Move! Pike shouted toward the hall. But now the back room wasn't a negotiation table. It was a cage. Bumpy stepped toward Calvin. Calvin was crying openly now, shaking so hard his teeth clicked. I can fix this, Calvin begged. Bumpy, please, I can. Bumpy grabbed Calvin by the collar and pulled him close enough that Calvin could smell his breath. You already fixed it, Bumpy said. You fixed it the moment you chose money over men. Calvin sobbed. They said they'd destroy my sister. Bumpy's eyes went cold. And you destroyed my family in Harlem. Bumpy shoved Calvin into the chair so hard it scraped. Then Bumpy turned back to Pike. Pike had pulled a pistol now, aiming at Bumpy, but his confidence was cracked. Call your dogs off, Pike snarled, trying to sound in control. Bumpy smiled faintly. I didn't bring dogs, Bumpy said. I brought wolves. Pike's face tightened. Whitey's delayed, Pike barked. You're alone. Bumpy leaned closer, voice almost gentle. That's where you're wrong. Pike's eyes flicked again toward the hallway. Footsteps. Heavy. Calm. Not panicked. Whoever was coming wasn't running. They were hunting. Then the voice came deep and familiar, cutting through the smoke. Boss. Pike's eyes widened. Bumpy didn't even turn his head yet. He just closed his eyes for half a second, like he'd been waiting for this exact syllable. Whitey Morrison. He stepped into the doorway with a pistol in one hand and a badge in the other, an NYPD badge, ripped from some officer who wouldn't be using it anymore. Whitey's jaw was tight, shirt collar torn, knuckles split. I got delayed, Whitey said, but not stopped. Pike's gun shook slightly. Bumpy opened his eyes. And now Pike understood what too late meant. Whitey's men flooded the hallway behind him, Harlem soldiers, not Schultz's paid strangers. They moved fast, quiet, with that cold discipline that meant they had already decided who was dying today. Pike backed toward the table, gun still up. Bumpy stepped closer. Noon came, Bumpy said. You wanted me alone. You wanted me scared. Bumpy nodded at Calvin. But you gave me something instead. Pike's voice cracked with anger. What? Bumpy's eyes burned. A name. Bumpy reached into his coat pocket, not for a weapon, but for the toy train. He placed it on the table like a headstone. You used a baby's toy to threaten me, Bumpy said softly. So now every man in Harlem will know you don't fight like men. You fight like rats. Pike's lips curled. Dutch Schultz is going to burn you alive. Bumpy cut him off. Dutch Schultz won't get the chance. Then Bumpy nodded once to Whitey. Whitey stepped forward, pressing the gun to Pike's forehead. Pike's eyes went wide, not because he feared death, but because he finally realized he wasn't dying for Dutch Schultz. He was dying for a mistake. Bumpy leaned in and whispered the sentence Pike would take to the grave. You came for my empire. Bumpy's voice hardened into iron. But you touched my people. And from upstairs, faint but real, came a sound that made Bumpy's chest tighten, a woman coughing. Mabel. Alive. The consequences hit at once. Eddie was gone. Lucky was gone. The traitor was exposed. And Schultz had just declared open war on Harlem. But Bumpy wasn't grieving yet. He was counting. Because now the real question wasn't whether Pike would survive. It was, how many more men like Calvin were still inside Bumpy's circle? Harlem, Wednesday, November 9th, 1932. 4:41 p.m. By late afternoon, Harlem wasn't whispering anymore. It was roaring. News moved faster than police radios. Faster than paid-off reporters. Faster than fear. It traveled the way Harlem always traveled, through barbershops, churches, numbers windows, stoops and storefronts. St. Clair's social club had exploded into violence. Not a simple shooting. A message. Men who weren't from Harlem had walked in thinking they could bend the neighborhood with threats and money. And they didn't walk back out. By sundown, the streets carried a single sharp phrase. Bumpy didn't bow. But Bumpy wasn't celebrating. He stood inside Dr. Solomon Green's clinic in a dim back room where the air smelled like rubbing alcohol and sweat. On the bed lay Mabel Parker, face pale, lips cracked, eyes half open. Her breathing was ragged, each inhale a fight. A blood-stained cloth rested near her hand. Dr. Green moved quickly, quietly. She's alive, the doctor murmured. But she's weak. The stress could have killed her. Bumpy stared at her like he was looking at the cost of war in human form. Whitey stood nearby, arms folded, jaw clenched. She keeps asking for Eddie, Whitey said. Bumpy didn't answer. Because there were answers you couldn't give without poisoning a room. Dr. Green finished securing bandages and turned to Bumpy. I need medicine, Green said. Real medicine. Not what we can buy on the street. Bumpy nodded once. You'll have it. Whitey looked at him. Boss? Eddie. Bumpy cut him off with one glance. Not now. Then Bumpy stepped out into the clinic's hallway where shadows clung to the walls. A man waited there, nervous, sweating through his shirt despite the cold. Calvin Ricks. The traitor. He had been brought in alive, hands bound, face bruised. Not beaten like an animal. Beaten like a man who made a choice and now had to live long enough to regret it. Calvin lifted his eyes and immediately dropped them. He spoke first, voice brittle. I can help you, Bumpy. Bumpy stared at him. You already helped Dutch Schultz, Bumpy said. Calvin swallowed hard. I didn't know Eddie would die. Bumpy's voice stayed calm, but every word cut. That's the problem with betrayal, Bumpy said. It spreads farther than you think. It kills people you never meant to kill. Calvin's lips trembled. I did it for my sister, Calvin whispered. Bumpy leaned in slightly. And for money, Bumpy added. Calvin's mouth opened, but no defense came. Because there wasn't one. Whitey stepped forward. Boss, the streets are buzzing. Schultz's people are angry. They're going to respond. Bumpy nodded slowly. I know. This was the aftershock. The club was only the quake. Now came the collapse. Harlem had just seen that Schultz wasn't untouchable. And Schultz had just seen Bumpy was willing to spill blood inside a social club to prove a point. That meant the next move wouldn't be subtle. It would be brutal. Whitey lowered his voice. Cops are circling too. They heard shots. They didn't stop it, but now they'll use it. Bumpy looked down the hallway thinking. In a single day he had gained something priceless, fear in his enemies. And he had lost something worse than money. He had lost certainty. Because if Calvin could be bought, how many others were already slipping? Bumpy turned to Calvin. You said you can help, Bumpy said. Calvin nodded quickly, desperate. Yes. Yes, I can tell you everything. Names. Contacts. Where Schultz's drop points are. Bumpy interrupted. I don't want your information. Calvin blinked. Then what? Bumpy's eyes hardened. I want your penance. Calvin's breath hitched. Bumpy stepped closer until Calvin had nowhere to look but up at him. "You're going to call Dutch Schultz," Bumpy said. Calvin's face drained of color. Bumpy, if I call him wrong, he'll kill my sister." Bumpy's voice sharpened. "And if you don't call him, I'll make sure you live long enough to watch Harlem spit on your name." Calvin started shaking. Whitey frowned. "Boss, you want him to lure Schultz?" Bumpy nodded. "Not Schultz," Bumpy said. "Schultz won't step into Harlem himself." He looked at Calvin. "I want you to call the man who thinks he runs this war from the shadows." Calvin whispered, "Pike is dead." Bumpy's eyes narrowed. "Then the next one," Bumpy said. "The one who signs the checks. The one who handles the cops. The one who thinks he can buy Harlem like a bottle of gin." Calvin swallowed. "You mean Rocco DiMeo?" Bumpy didn't smile. He simply said, "Good, now we're getting honest." Because this wasn't just revenge anymore. This was strategy. Bumpy had to flip the pressure. If Schultz's crew could use Eddie's family as bait, Bumpy could use Calvin's guilt as a blade. Whitey's voice dropped. "And what happens to Calvin after the call?" Bumpy stared down the hallway toward Mabel's room, hearing her cough. Then he answered with a cold certainty that made Whitey's spine tighten. "That depends." Whitey held his gaze. "On what?" Bumpy's eyes went darker. "On whether Eddie Parker's son grows up with a father's name." He turned back to Calvin. "Or grows up with a ghost." Calvin began to sob again because now he understood. The war wasn't outside. It was inside the choices Bumpy was about to make. And outside the clinic, Harlem waited angry, alive and ready, because by nightfall, everyone knew Dutch Schultz wouldn't let this humiliation stand. He would answer. And when he answered, it wouldn't be a club. It would be blood in the streets. Harlem, Thursday, November 10th, 1932. 2:18 a.m. The phone rang again. Same sound. Same poison. But this time, Bumpy Johnson didn't let it ring 3 times. He picked up on the first. Calvin Ricks sat across the room, hands shaking, sweat pouring down his face like confession. Bumpy spoke into the receiver calmly. "Talk." Calvin swallowed and forced the words out, voice cracking. "It's Calvin. I got pushed out. Bumpy's finished. I can give you what's left." A pause. Then a voice smooth, pleased. "Where?" Calvin glanced at Bumpy like a man begging for forgiveness. "Behind the Lafayette Bakery. The alley. Right now." The line went dead. Whitey leaned in. "You really think Rocco comes himself?" Bumpy's eyes stayed on the clinic door where Mabel lay breathing. "No," Bumpy said. "But he'll send someone important." Minutes later, tires whispered outside. Footsteps. A shadow moved in the alley. Whitey raised his pistol, then froze. Because the man who stepped into the dim light wasn't Rocco. It was an NYPD detective in a wool coat, holding a warrant. And behind him, 2 more officers. Paid officers. Not here for Schultz. Here for Bumpy. Bumpy stared at Calvin. Calvin's mouth opened but no sound came. Because now the truth landed like a brick. Calvin didn't just betray Bumpy to Schultz. He sold him to the police. The detective lifted the warrant. "Ellsworth Johnson," he said. "You're under arrest." Bumpy didn't fight. He only looked at Calvin with quiet disgust. Then Bumpy smiled small, cold. Because in the next room, Mabel coughed again, alive. And that was the irony. Dutch Schultz didn't take Harlem from Bumpy that night. He took Bumpy out of Harlem. But as Bumpy was led into the cold, he left one last instruction to Whitey: keep the rules. Because even in chains, Bumpy knew one thing: Harlem would still remember who refused to bow. If you want the next Bumpy story darker, faster, and even more brutal, hit like and subscribe.